to be given an opportunity to sit in a room with a man that, I personally believed to be a murderer, was just, it was hard to not do it. It was hard to pass on that project. The first time I met with him, I didn't discuss his guilt or innocence, but there was one point, I think it was the second or third day I was there during the first trip, that he was going on about all the people who just assumed he was guilty, and nobody gave him a chance, and all these people jumped down his neck, before the trial had even started. And then he turned and looked at me, and basically he was asking me what I thought. And I said, I'm sorry, O.J., I thought you were guilty then, and I still think you're guilty. And he just exploded. He said, I know you do. But a moment later, it was like he was back to himself, and he laughed, and he said, and thank you for being honest with me. Now, I do want to clarify that. It wasn't, that I'm such a courageous guy. But from the tenor of our conversations, I think it was very clear to O.J. that I thought he was guilty, and for me to have lied to him at that point would have been counterproductive. So we just moved on. One of the first things he said to me was, I'm not confessing to anything. I have nothing to confess. I don't know anything about it. And so I looked at him, and I looked at the attorney who was in the room, and I basically said, what am I doing here? And he said, no, don't worry, we'll get this handled. But I left the room, and I called Judith Regan on my cell phone, and I said, we should just pull out of this thing. This is all very squirrely. And the attorney, heard me talking to Judith, and he wanted to talk to her. So I gave him my phone. I walked back in the room, and O.J. was sitting there, and he said, I thought this whole thing was going to be fiction. And I said, I don't know where you got that, because I don't write fiction books. I save the fiction for my screenplays. I write nonfiction books, and that's what I thought I was doing here. And eventually what happened is the attorney came out of the room and said, look, O.J. and I are going to have a little talk, and we'll get back to you. So they left, and a couple of hours later, O.J. came back, and he said, look, I apologize, and I guess I'm nervous. I've been confused about this whole thing. And let's get started, and do you mind starting with the easy stuff? And of course I was going to start with the easy stuff. I wasn't going to sort of plunge into the night of the murders, and we started. At the end of that first day, he was elated. He said, boy, that was great, and and it was actually fun to talk to you. And I said, I was trying to keep it light. I said, we ghostwriters are basically like unlicensed therapists. And I said, don't be afraid to cry. Everybody cries. And he sort of laughed and said, I'm not crying for you. Added a couple of expletives. But he was just joking around, but he felt pretty good. In order for me to be able to fashion some kind of intelligent narrative out of our, many hours of conversation, I had to keep pushing for questions. I had to keep pushing him. And at one point, he was quite upset, and he said, I'm not going to tell you that I, cut my wife's throat open and watched her eyes roll back in her head, words to that effect. There were a number of details that emerged in the course of our conversations, and one of them was, he talked, for example, about the back gate to Nicole's house being broken. And I thought, that's a very small detail, but it's not insignificant. I didn't know that. I wasn't so obsessed with the case that I followed it that closely. Maybe somebody else knew that. But to me, it was interesting, and he volunteered that detail. And he also happened to say, I've told that woman so many times to get it fixed, which, spoke to his attitude. The other thing he told me is that when he was in the courtyard and everything was sort of going down, Ron Goldman was sort of trapped there, and he actually tried to defend, himself and Nicole. And I thought that, and he described his karate stance. And I said, wow, that's really unusual, because I know I never heard anything about a karate stance. And to this day, I don't know whether Ron Goldman, is a karate expert, but I do, he probably got into a defensive posture, and that's good enough for me. And the other thing that was very telling is that he talked about when he left the alley. And I had been under the impression that at the end of the alley he had made a right to the corner of Bundy and Montana, and then made a left toward San Vicente. And he said, no. why would I have made that right? I made a left, and then I went up Gretna Green to San Vicente, and from there on up to Rockingham. And then he saw the look on my face, and he said, well, that's the way I would have gone. And it was sort of a tense moment, but, you know, we just got through it and move on.